Now, at page 3, you make this point that repeated deliberate publication of DOFs with the intention of doing damage must be dealt with firmly and should be taken by the authorities within the law. I think that's a reflection of your sentiment that DOFs is a problem, and that when it is purveyed in this way, particularly, not only, but particularly when it seeks to undermine national interests, that has to be dealt with firmly. And I think you used the word decisively as well elsewhere in your submission.
Yes.
That would be an accurate reflection of your sentiment.
Yes.
Now, you also then make the point that one has to be mindful of what the intention is.
Yes.
Right? Now, you heard some of the earlier representatives talk about intention. Dan Shefford spoke about intention. I'm not sure if you were here yet, but certainly the previous submitter talked about intention. Now, harm can be caused intentionally or unintentionally, correct? So if we agree that a particular posting or an image is harmful on that assumption, whether I put it out there intentionally or unintentionally, harm is done, right?
Potentially, yes.
Yes. So the difference between intentional and unintentional cannot affect how we deal with that harm that is out there. We have to take steps to deal with the harm. Would you agree?
I think that would depend on the particular situation, and rather than just a broad brush kind of thing.
I agree.
Yeah.
Where I'm coming from is really to say to you or suggest to you that you must have a range of different remedies to fit the situation.
Yeah.
And if you have harm caused unintentionally, that obviously will have to be dealt with differently from harm caused intentionally. And I know you say you want to add in the words maliciously, but that's a definitional issue. But as a broad concept, you would agree?
I see no reason to disagree. Yeah.
Right. So would you agree that if harm has been caused but unintentionally, one has to find remedies to deal with the harm that is out there, whether you clarify, you take down, you make sure that there's an apology, or you make sure that there is a way to redress it, whichever is the range of options chosen best to deal with that harm. But you would treat the person who posted it very differently from someone who posted it intentionally, correct?
Yes.
Right. For the person who posts it or purveys it intentionally, there could well be other consequences. And I think that stands to reason.
Oh, yes.
Right, thank you. So I think we have sort of sketched out the broad parameters of what the issue of DOFs is. You then also deal with questions on how the different types of responses that will be appropriate in the different situations. Right. Now I want to show you an exchange that this committee had with Patrick Daniel, and to see if you can agree with some of the propositions there. If I can have the transcript of 23rd March put up. And start with, I'll start with page 268, if I may. Mr. Loh, I'll just take you through some of the excerpts. Stop me if you think I'm going too quickly. Okay. But I'll read it out to you as well. So Mr. Shanmugam was asking, I think, a panel, including Mr. Patrick Daniel, some questions, and he said this. If I may pick up on the last point, skipping a few lines down, some sort of quick, say, executive action to take down, coupled with remedy, if the other party wants to challenge it, subsequently to go back, take it down, or rather reinstate it back. But really, the quick takedown is essential to deal with the virality and nature of the digital age, coupled with a range of penalties, depending on, if we can use the term culpability, on the state of mind of the individual concerned. That may also then deal with another point that I think Mr. Daniel made, which is that it may have been false, but the person may not have known. And that may then, how you deal with it may be related to what sorts of penalties are imposed. In some cases, if there's no intention but it is false, it could just be a takedown. In some cases, if there is intention and actual deliberateness involved on the part of the person putting it up, then the penalties can be higher. Would you agree with the broad approach outlined here?
For me personally, my threshold for want of a better word, to tolerate content that are disagreeable is quite high. So, like what the previous presenter was saying, sometimes you have the opposite effect of removing something.
The Streisand effect.
Yes, and we have seen that online quite a number of times, in fact. You know, and viewership can triple, quadruple, you know, because
People are curious as to what you
Yes.
have taken down.
yes. So I would caution, as I said in my submission, that the government must exercise patience and wisdom. And what I mean by that is that you don't overreact, because overreacting will result in overreach. And I think there are examples with regard to my own experience with the government. When in 2015, when I was with TOC, for example, the Protection from Harassment Act was used against us, which we thought was totally unfair. And the act was not meant for that. From all the parliamentary debates that I read, the act was meant for vulnerable individual
That's
people.
been a part of a court application, and the judgment is issued. We'll leave it at that.
Correct.
But I think where you're coming from is this, that yes, we have to deal with or be clear about how we define what that threshold is. But I'm just now focused on what is the appropriate recourse and the different boxes of the recourse for the moment. So if you assume for a moment that whatever is the remedy is the appropriate remedy for that situation, I think you would broadly accept, in fact, I think you do accept, it's similar to what you just told me earlier, that depending on whether there's intention or no intention, there's a gradation of different remedies available,
Yes.
right? And if you look further down the page of this transcripts to, okay, I stopped at line 23, so if you could just read further. So long as we are focused on falsehoods or opinions based on falsehoods which are apparent to everybody, and what I mean is opinions are made and everybody is aware what those facts are based on which the opinions are made, and those facts themselves are false, then what you do is you have a range of remedies depending on the degree of culpability of the person involved. You would agree with that, correct?
Yes.
Then Mr. Daniel says there must be some way in which the party being penalized is given a right to, and then if you just skip over the next few lines, it says, line 16, Mr. Shanmugam says, that's why I think it probably has to be a multi-stage process. Maybe where the takedown comes immediately after the first order, and then the person who feels that he is not culpable, or anyway his post ought to be up, then be entitled to a right of some neutral place to have that decided. Over the page. Line 4, just as he has a right to have the takedown reviewed, if there's any penalty, he must also have a right to challenge it appropriately. We haven't sort of buttoned down to that sort of detail, but that is perfectly sensible and civilized, I think. Yes? Mr. Daniel says, thank you. Again, would you agree with that framework?
Yes. On principle, yes.
Yes, right.
But I also did say in my submission that in this sort of framework, sometimes it practically, and it really comes down, because I've gone through it, it comes down to whether the person involved is able to go through that process. By that, I mean financially.
I understand.
Yeah.
I think that's something that has to be taken into account.
Yes.
But what we're trying to just grapple with first is conceptually what
Yes.
that process should look like and what that staging process, which has just been outlined,
Yes.
should look like. Now, you then go on to okay, your report is not paginated, but I think if you go to page 3 of it, broadly speaking, 3, 4, and part of 5, what you then do is try and frame what should drive the kind of counter remedies or countermeasures there should be. I think we've gone through the first of your points, which is the intent and the level of the intent. You then say that any response should bear in mind that one should not stifle or restrict free public discourse.
Yes.
Correct? Yes. And I'll just want to turn to that now. So in dealing with that, you talk about the media landscape, and you say, this is page 4, top of page 4. You say that there's been raised suspicions of the mainstream media. I mean, I'm not sure we'll debate this. That there are views about the mainstream media and the Edelman publications and other barometers. And I think people still, we've heard from CNA and MediaCorp and SPH,
Yes.
and at least based on what they tell us anecdotally, based on the evidence that they have collected themselves,
Yes.
they do see that people go back to these news sources,
Yes.
and people come back, which they tell us is an indication of the trust that people still have in the mainstream media sources.
Yeah.
You wouldn't disagree with that, right?
Actually, I do, because I know that the number of
I thought
likes
so.
you have and the number of retweets and all that from your report does not represent trust.
No, it's not so much the likes or the retweets, which I
Correct.
think I understand where you are coming from.
Yes.
But it's more a question of, when there is a
Yes.
potential news event or a big news event,
Yes.
they say that they see the number of eyeballs landing
Yes.
on their pages.
Yes. And we experienced the same thing at the Online Citizen, at Public House, the other website that I ran. My friends in other websites, we all see a spike during the elections, during the Lee siblings disputes with the Prime Minister.
So when there's anything newsworthy, you're saying that people go
Yes.
to both mainstream
So
and to alternative sites.
When I heard the mainstream media executives saying that people go back to them, and that shows there's trust, I really question that. Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think I'll leave you to debate that with them separately.
Yeah.
But you go on to then say that at the third paragraph of that page, same page, you then seem to suggest that there is a differentiation in the way alternative media is treated and the mainstream media is treated. And you cite, amongst others, the Administration of Justice Act.
Yes.
Now, did you follow the debate on the passing of this bill?
Not as closely as I should have.
Right.
Yeah.
Two propositions. One, you would agree that these provisions, they apply equally to mainstream media as they do to alternative sites. Would you accept?
Sorry.
The Act and what it seeks to do, what it seeks to achieve, what it says you can do or can't do, would apply equally to mainstream media as it does to alternative sites. There's no differentiation.
Administration of Justice Act. There is one point about the Act that I question, which is that
No, I'm simply starting from the premise of how they apply in your you say here, not equally to both of these platforms, the mainstream media and the alternative sites. And I'm just trying to get you to see if you would agree that this Act and the provisions contained in this Act apply equally to both mainstream as well as to alternative sites.
Administration of Justice Act. My point here, and I mentioned the other acts such as the Election and the Films Act, is that it is not enforced sometimes fairly. For example, on cooling off days, for example, under the Election Act, registered media under the law are allowed to publish election news, while alternative media, because you are not registered, are not allowed to do so.
But that's not a disequal treatment, if I may suggest. That's really a question of how it's licensed and which ones are accredited. But just want to keep to this Administration of Justice Act. You don't really have a basis to disagree with me when I say that it applies equally to both, right?
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
So it's not a question of having an act that applies only to alternative sites, as it were, right?
Sorry, I don't understand what.
In other words, there is no suggestion that this act and the provisions of this act can only apply or should only apply to alternative media.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct.
Thank you. You then also go on to say that, well, there are other legislations which question or raise concerns over the police force IMDA with wide-ranging powers and so on. Now, would you say that even in the context of the latest survey results, which show that Singaporeans trust the police, that they have believed that they are safe and that their interests are well looked after by the police?
Yes.
You still say that? Let me
Yes,
just
I
show
do.
you. Let me just show you those findings, and then you can comment on that in the context of this paragraph. If I can put up the Straits Times article of a few days ago, 24th of March, yes. Just look quickly at the key points. These are the public perception survey results. You have 93% who feel safe walking in their neighborhood at night. 92% felt that general safety and security is good or very good. 90% felt that the police was ready to deal with any major law and order incident and are well prepared to respond to future security needs. 88% felt that police provided high-quality service. 87% regarded the police as a world-class crime-fighting organization, and almost half said the installation of police cameras in housing estates made them feel safer. Now, in the context of these issues, I mean, you are raising this point as concerns for Singaporeans, raising concerns for Singaporeans. But how would your view here square off with these findings?
I think first point to note is that the survey was done by the police, not that I'm questioning that, just an observation. And also we need to see the details of how the whole poll and the survey was framed and the questions that were asked and stuff. We all know that questions can be phrased in a certain way to elicit a certain response. Not that I'm questioning this, but even though despite this, the point is that for any authority to be able to enter your home without a warrant and to take any document and anything, in fact, and that I believe was the wording in the law.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think if you want to make that point, I think you should be fair about what exactly are the circumstances in which it can be done. It is not any time and any document.
Yes, I understand.
Yes.
I understand.
Right. So
there were circumstances, yes.
Yes, it's under very strict circumstances.
Yes.
Yes.
Even so, I would say that that might not, in my opinion, is a bit of an overreach. I think because I know MDA officers, they are, according to news reports that I've read, to be put through training by the police and police training. But even so, I think it is quite troubling to me that there are such powers.
You see, ultimately, the purpose of having the police force is to ensure that there's safety and security, law and order.
Correct.
And if these are objectives which meet that purpose, and you see the survey results, I mean, to address your point about these questions raising serious concerns for Singaporeans, I'm just suggesting to you that it doesn't quite square off what you're saying.
I think the survey results don't really relate to this, because these questions about police entering your home without a warrant and all that were not put to those people that were polled in this survey.
But wouldn't you agree it's part of the ecosystem, right? It's part of the range of powers.
Of course. I think generally, if I go out and ask people, they would say yes.
Yes, and I think would you agree that that's at least one marker, if not a good marker, for what the public regards the police institution as?
I think generally, Singaporeans have trust in the police force, in our judicial system and all that. I don't think that is my dispute.
Right. And then in the next paragraph, you then say that mere expression of a view can result in serious consequences. I mean, you're not suggesting here that merely expressing a view can result in arbitrary serious consequences.
Arbitrary as in? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, put it this way. If I went out there and tomorrow I defamed you, obviously you have a recourse, and I can't exercise my free speech without having regard to some of these constraints. And if I breach these constraints, there are consequences, right?
Yes.
But these consequences are based on law, based on what the rule of law provides, based on rules that we all know. It's quite a different thing to suggest that saying something can result in consequences arbitrarily, which is
No,
a very
I didn't say
different basket.
arbitrarily.
Right. So you're not suggesting that?
No, I'm
in
not
this paragraph?
suggesting that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you then give an example of where an expression of a view can then lead to a serious consequence which is unfair?
In fact, I give the example of Mr. Lee Sheng-woo, who posted on his Facebook page about a comment about our judicial system. And subsequently, the case now is pending before the court, I think.
I'm not going to go into that case, which
Yes.
is part of pending in court. But generally, if we have contempt laws, they are for a reason.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Correct.
And if there is a belief that laws are breached,
Yes.
and it is referred to court,
Correct.
that's really the rule of law operating,
Yes.
isn't it?
Correct.
Correct?
And
And
it
it
is the law itself that is being questioned.
But why do you have a quarrel with a law which many parts of the Commonwealth have as well? You don't act in a manner which scandalizes the judiciary. You don't act in a manner which affects matters which are before the courts. You don't publish or post or say something which is in contempt of court. Those are all fairly well established.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and from my limited understanding, I think contempt of court laws in other jurisdictions are quite circumscribed, isn't it? They are quite rarely used. Am I not?
That I don't have the numbers to.
Yes.
I'm not sure you do as well. But the point is, here, these are laws which are meant to preclude someone from personally attacking judges. You can disagree with judgments, you can disagree with outcomes, but I think these are laws which are meant to ensure that no one takes personal issue with the judiciary. Would you agree?
That is what the law is meant to be.
Yes, and there should be
Meant
nothing
to do,
wrong
I
with
mean.
that, right?
Sorry?
And there should be nothing wrong with that because the judiciary is one of the key pillars, key institutions of our
Yes,
society.
correct.
And we don't want to undermine that.
Yes, correct. I fully agree. And that is not what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that the law itself is problematic. And therefore, the enforcement of that law can lead to certain undesirable consequences. For example, and I go back to this example again, Mr. Lee's example, that instead of debating him and challenging his ideas or his claim or his perceived claim, to use the law in this manner will shut down debate. And in order for our society to be a critical one with an ability to ascertain and to question, we need debates like that, and we need opportunities like that, right? To use these sort of opportunities to, well, for want of a better word, to practice, what we may be taught in Media Literacy Council programs and such.
Yes. But Mr. Loh, I mean, I think you would agree that I think as a starting point, you can't just go out there and say things as you like, right? There are to borrow Prof. Tan's language, he says that, whilst you have the right to speak as you like, there's a concomitant responsibility to be responsible in speech.
Yes.
And by that, he means you must look out for issues like contempt, for questions of undermining privileges of Parliament, for example.
Yes.
You must also be mindful not to say or do anything which incites sedition or is racially motivated.
Yes.
Right.
That really comes down to how much threshold the authorities is willing to give.
But
I believe Dr. Gillian Cole was of the views that falsehood, in fact, have a place in public discourse.
I know. She said that, and I think you posted on it as well. You see, I do read, alternative media sites.
Yes, now I know.
And I found it interesting.
Thank you.
But the point is, I think one must be clear what the rules of engagement would be, right? Yes. You can have free speech, but there must be a balance, and there must be. You can't go out there and as in my earlier example, say something or post something about the Quran in a derogatory way. There's a limit to it.
My view is that I've been doing this for more than 10 years online, interacting with these people that you might want to be legislating against or their actions, right? And from my experience, I can tell you that if you engage, you may have a different outcome. And the outcome may be better than legislating,
Yes,
than throwing the book at them.
No, don't.
But I am also aware that, like the law minister has been emphasizing, that we are not talking about opinions, even
Yes.
though that itself I question. But that is another issue. We are talking about deliberate online falsehood,
Yes.
and for me, with malicious intent. And what Dr. Carol Soon said was low breach and high breach, which I agree with. And I think that is a determination that the select committee might want to consider.
Yes. I think we go back to what we started with when we first started this session, which is you must have the ability to differentiate. And there must be a variegated response depending on what type of issue we are faced with, right? And I think you would not have no issue with that kind of approach.
No, I don't.
And you must also bear in mind that we are looking at falsehoods. I mean, we use the word deliberate online falsehoods.
Yes.
You have a slightly different definition, but I think we all go towards the, I suppose, direction that you must have some level of culpability.
Yes.
And then you start thinking in terms of whether you do countermeasures by way of legislation or whether the best thing to do is to upscale the media literacy of the population and educate better. Some are long-term, some are short-term. But I think where this seems to be going and what a lot of people have told us is that you take all of these options together as a regime that you have, and you need to have this available so that you can have a differentiated response to the issues that is before you at any particular given time. And I think you, from what I've heard so far from you, you have no difficulty with that.
No, I don't. Although I do have questions about the fair enforcement of that. I am sorry to have to come back to this because from my end, I'm on the receiving end of the legislations that Parliament creates. And sometimes it seems a little unfair to me. And of course, I can give you examples, but I shall not go into that. That sometimes the enforcement of it is more strictly done for alternative media than for mainstream media. And I have written about it, actually.
In fact, in the language you use here, okay, sorry, again, I don't have the page numbers, but it's about 5 or 6 pages down where you say that the government's position seems to be a militant one.
Yes.
Now, you would agree that that's quite strong a word, quite a harsh
Yes, I realize that.
characterization. And that's not quite fair, isn't it? Because, you see, one of the things we're trying to determine now, which I've been putting to you, is that one must have a ability to have a variegated response. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And that's on top of the fact that you bring in questions like fact-checking councils. I mean, that's what's been suggested,
Yes.
and I think this committee will consider. You have literacy, education campaigns, and so on. So why would you describe the approach as being militant?
I think because it's my experience since 2006 when I started the Online Citizen with a couple of friends. I remember back then the internet was relatively new, blogging was really very new, and that was one of the reasons why I started the website, because blogging was simple to do. And later on, social media came along. Mm-hmm. But right from the beginning, the approach that the government took towards alternative media, bloggers, was a very antagonistic, a very confrontational approach. And we were demonized by the mainstream media at a constant level. If I may continue, sorry. But that was fine with us because it's part of debating. It's part of the rough and tough of being online, and we accept that. The thing that really changed my opinion at a more fundamental level was when the government started to create laws or enforce laws against us.
But wait, you've covered this. Yes. You see, the point is, if you take that position, then at one level, there's no need for you to be here and no need for you to be making these submissions here. The point here is that I think we are looking at DOS, Deliberate Online Falsehoods, here, now on a clean slate. We have looked at what impact it's had elsewhere in the world. I think you agree now that it
Yes.
has impact in Singapore, and it's a serious one. And we must have a range of responses available to
Yes.
government to deal with it. And this committee will consider what is the scope of that,
Yes.
how it should be done, and in what form. So I think all I'm suggesting to you is that it's somewhat premature at this point in time to reach those conclusions, when even the committee themselves has not reached any conclusion. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I will agree with that. But my submission and my sharing with the committee is so that you have an idea from my perspective as a practitioner of a user of online space, the things that I faced and my team faced when we started out. In order to avoid unnecessary enforcement against us or people like us who are online. Now, the reason why I brought up my past experiences is that I have always wondered, why would not the government engage instead of confront?
You made the point here. I'm
No,
not sh-
if I may, the point I'm trying to make here is that in order to combat falsehood, deliberate online falsehood, we need everyone on board. And I agree with that because we are talking about things like national security, our sovereignty, our national harmony, and these are very important things. In order to shield ourselves or to build this resilience, you need everyone on board, and that everyone must include the alternative media.
Yeah, I don't agree. I don't disagree. In fact, you say here, you raise an interesting idea. If you just look at towards the end of your submission, you talk about how a fund could be raised, set aside.
Yeah.
And I think the purpose of that really fits in with what you've just said, which is to raise the standards, raise awareness, inform the online community, and I'm quoting from you, on the pitfalls in those areas when publishing content online.
Yes.
And I think speaking for myself, it's an interesting idea. I think one certainly that this committee will consider.
Thank you.
And you go on to say that if nothing else, you'll signal that the idea is really to go upstream, to inoculate, to make sure that we have built a more resilient society.
Yes.
And I don't think anyone on this committee would disagree with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if I may, I would like to bring up this example. Since we are talking about real life examples, and I think previous presenters have all given examples. And we talk about what happens in other countries and all. I am more interested in what happens in Singapore, and whether past incidents have lessons for us.
What is this going towards? What's the frame of your point?
Oh, I'm saying that as a reporter, as an online alternative news site, what would be my limits? In terms of, if I report something that the government says is a fact, and I know that, or at least from my investigation, I know that it is not a fact, and I cannot prove it in court, and neither has the government proved it in court. Now, in such a situation, right, if I publish this story or this series of stories, would I be accused of deliberate online falsehood?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges that this committee will have to grapple with.
And I'm bringing this up because it is a real life.
I understand. And as I
incident.
said at the outset, what we are trying to grapple with is in several buckets.
Yes.
What is the problem? Then should we deal with it? If so,
Yes.
how? And then what is the mechanism and the process by which that is done?
Yes.
So I take your point. I think those are all issues that will have to be deliberated here and will be considered.
Okay.
And I suggest that we don't jump the gun. Let this committee receive all the evidence, deliberate, and I'm sure the report will be out. We'll consider all of these points, including the points you raised here and your suggestion too. Right, Mr. Loh?
If I may, I think back in 2008 when the government convened the advisory council on the new media, I think it was called AIMS. I think there was a suggestion for a code of conduct for bloggers. I think it if I'm not wrong, I don't think it was the council that suggested that, but it was a group of bloggers who suggested that.
Yes.
Because the government was concerned about the kind of content that bloggers were putting out. And incidentally, there were more political bloggers back then than now, which is very disappointing to me.
Well, you remain in that space very actively.
Only on Facebook nowadays, though. But the point is that, yes, we can perhaps consider initiatives like that. I believe that in order to combat deliberate online falsehood, it is not just the government, like some people have said. And in fact, I think the government's role will be quite limited. And I think the real foot on the ground, if you will, are those people who are at the front line.
Yeah.
And those people who may not be seen as credible or may not be accredited and all that, but who nonetheless have some legitimacy among certain portions of the population.
I think,
and it comes back to my point that the government must engage everyone, because it is the government of everyone, and not just people who don't get involved in falsehood. It's everyone. Right.
all right. Thank you, Mr. Loh. I've got no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Indeed, Mr. Loh, I think this select committee is engaging everyone, every stakeholder in this space, and for sure it requires a multi-pronged approach to resolving this.
Correct.